Mike Peterson with Loft Labs, technical marketing engineer, and I'm joined here by Greg Haynes. Do you want to introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about what you do and where
Yeah,
you're
sure.
at?
I'm a software architect at Autodesk. I focus mostly on our cloud software delivery platform, which internally we call CloudOS. I think I'm here to talk about CNOE, which is an open source project we launched with a few other organizations around building internal developer platforms.
So I guess when it comes to Kubernetes, it's very hard to build something that's the same at a bunch of different places. Is that kind of what CNOE is covering, or what is CNOE doing?
Yeah, it actually came out of some internal work that we were doing where, we're not a Kubernetes shop internally today. And so we had a team who was kind of working towards like what would it look like if we were to transition to a Kubernetes shop, and start using some of the standard technologies there, like using not just Kubernetes as a runtime, but also like using Crossplane, using Argo, then also using Backstage integrate with that. And there were a few things came up. One of them is like we were talking with a lot of our internal stakeholders, like UX designers, PMs, things like that, about okay, what would this look like? And you get really deep really fast on like, well, on Kubernetes you do this thing, and then they'd be asking questions relative to our current platform. It's like, oh, well, that's solved with Argo, or oh, this thing's solved with Crossplane, and this thing you do with a composition function, and this other thing you do with the Backstage integrating to Kubernetes. And it quickly was like, you can try and write product definitions for those things, but if you're introducing like 4 or 5 really complex technologies like that, you're not going to get very far. Like you spend a lot of time. And so we kind of got to this point of like, we need to put something physical in people's hands where it's like, look, here's the full end-to-end thing. You just run it, you can play with it, and it just glues all those things together so that you can actually physically mess with the program. And we had the same problem for the developers too, where they were starting to spin up this thing. They need to have a local dev environment. They need to be able to CI it. And it's the same problem. Like, okay, we'll just install all these things, and like what? We're gonna spend a week learning about new technology to do that. So with all that like background, it's kind of like I've been making an analogy of that's IDP Builder is that tool I'm talking about. But the idea is to kind of like standardize like the internal developer platform using cloud native technologies, and then we have some tooling to help with that.
So did someone just go to KubeCon and they saw all these presentations and they're like, oh, that looks cool. Let me go ahead and check it out. Was it Jesse?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, Jesse. So Jesse's a colleague of mine, and yeah, he's been contributing a lot to it. Along with there's been a lot of help from other external contributors as well.
So like, you didn't want to have two teams that are using one team's using like Argo and one team's using Flux, right? Like, and you wanted to actually give them all the same thing, so everyone in Autodesk is using the same thing, or
depends on the situation. So like that one specifically comes up a lot. The Argo versus Flux, because those are two pretty widely adopted technologies. And what I really wanted more than that was like I wanted people to be able to talk about what it would mean to pick one or the other relative to all the other technologies, right? Like, okay, well, if we use Argo, we get these Backstage Argo integrations, or like something like that. And without like having the actual reference platform for people to use, all of that stuff is theoretical, and people weren't able to make good and like well-informed decisions about whether it is possible to mix and match or whether we really do need to consolidate on one of those things.
You end up with like 50 POCs everywhere too, like in the company, like as large as yours, I guess, compared to like smaller groups.
Yep. Yeah, and that's what you want to do. So it's really a couple ways we've been describing is like it's kind of a distribution more than anything else. It's a good analogy, like kind of like how Linux distributions, like there's some standard tools, like usually your package manager, right? That's provided by your distribution. But then they make all this other stuff work in a standard way. So like there's some assumptions you bake in. Like maybe I bake in an assumption like you're running systemd, and like we're baking in an assumption that you're going to be having Kubernetes as your base layer. But then on top of that, you have less and less assumptions about the software that you use. So hopefully we're getting into like some assumptions, but like not all assumptions.
So like at what stage would you start looking into CNOE? Like who are you targeting? People that are just getting started with Kubernetes and they see that there's like, they've already installed it and then they're thinking about what's next? Or are these people that are just learning about Kubernetes and you're like, here, just try and start with this before you do anything? Like, is it like a DevStack for OpenStack kind of like, here, try this out and like figure it out?
Yeah, well, so that's the tool, like that IDP Builder tool. That is a great analogy. I've actually been saying that like DevStack or like Minikube, what it was like early on Kubernetes, and now I know we use Kind and stuff, but it's like the same idea. Like if you want a technology to start getting widespread adoption, you got to let people play with it easily. and definitely that's one of the goals here. But when you ask first about like who's the intended audience, Canoe actually came out of like a handful of companies that were all in the similar spot where we either weren't Kubernetes shops or we were just transitioning to Kubernetes shops, but we knew we had a lot of legacy non-CNCF technology that we knew we wanted to migrate off of, but it was pretty scary. It were all sort of medium large size companies. So not large enough that we can say, oh, we'll just rewrite everything, but not small enough that we can just say, oh, we'll just adopt this new technology over here for cheap. It was like, we need to make some decisions about like, we'll adopt these technologies and it's going to be expensive. So we want to mitigate the risk associated with changing that decision later. And so like, well, it's all like just standardize some stuff. Like what stuff do we need to kind of like say is the base reference platform, and we'll all decide it together.
I think you're downplaying your Kubernetes experience a little bit too. Like you're saying your company's not a Kubernetes shop, but like what's your background in Kubernetes? I think you've been around Kubernetes now for like the last 7 years now.
Yeah, I mean, I've done some work in Kubernetes. I worked a fair amount on the Knative project before I moved over to Autodesk, and then I worked on some other stuff as well. Did some OpenStream contribution Kubernetes for a little bit, and obviously we both have an OpenStack background before.
Yeah, I think you're getting the crew back together for this project from a lot of the Knative people, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, and like what's funny with exactly, yeah, and not just that. There's also a lot of there's definitely a history repeating itself situation. Or like you made the great analogy before, like where like there's like some of the stuff is like DevStack for OpenStack, and like that's definitely part of what I feel like is going on here. It's like, look, early phase, like we had this phase with Kubernetes being a young technology. Now it's a fairly mature technology, but now there's this new phase where it's like, okay, Kubernetes plus a whole bunch of software on top of it is kind of becoming standardized and more mature.
Yeah.
Let's make that easy for people to use, and no longer like a mix and match. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. You got to choose your own adventure type of thing.
Is this more like targeting like on-prem stuff, or like just if anybody's using like AWS already, like they should be doing this in like EKS or the cloud or something like that, or what? What's the target?
We're definitely pretty much everybody in Canoe is a cloud. Like they're using their preferred cloud provider. As far as I know, I wouldn't be surprised if some folks have on-prem, but like it's not. As far as I know, we don't have big assumptions around that, but just practically, we're an AWS shop. I know lots of the other folks in Canoe are as well.
Well, it sounds like an awesome project. So like, do you have like an example of like what someone could expect if they use IDP Builder and just start out? Like what would it stand up for them?
Yeah, so you run it today, you basically get an integrated Kubernetes. So it actually just runs kind under the hood. It gets a Backstage, an Argo CD, and it actually uses one neat thing we introduced it has a Git server inside of it.
Okay.
Because we kind of introduced this way for you to develop on Argo applications more rapidly. As part of working on this, where if you want to work on an Argo application, usually you have to point it at somewhere that it's the source, right? The source is usually an external thing, like whether it's a Git repository or something. We wrote some tooling that was actually inspired by our work previously on Knative of this tool called Co, where you run one command, it builds the whole thing and sticks it in the Kubernetes cluster. Yeah. We wrote a similar thing for Argo, where you change source, it has a canoe : / just some directory, and you run the tool and it packages up Argo plus the thing it points at, sticks it in the kube cluster so Argo can point at the in-cluster Git server and read the resources as part of that package. So let's you basically use Argo as a local CD development tool rather than like having to push artifacts to some remote thing.
Carlos said it was kind of like automating infrastructure for infrastructure people, like we've had for I guess GitHub and stuff previously, right? Like for CI/CD. Would you compare it to that? Like it's quick changes to infrastructure that you can test with this instead of having to, So like you're doing it in kind, but eventually you want to do it in like real clusters. Yeah.
Yeah, Jesse had some good quotes in our doc that actually, like, we introduced this tool to our internal developers, and they had some great lines about it. Like one of them was like, look, this is finally, we've talked a lot about what it would mean to make dev, stage, and prod look the same, and that's always a hard thing to do with infrastructure management because there's so much state that's specific to the environment. But he was like, this is like the tool, this is the answer to that, or the best answer to that I've ever seen, where it is like dev, stage, and prod do actually look the same as my local environment finally.
That's really cool. So don't want to take up too much of your time, but how do I get started contributing? And then I think we also have I can plug it next week. I think next week Carlos is doing a stream kind of showing off some of this setup and everything. I'll try to put that even maybe in like the description so people can go there and watch it.
Awesome. Yeah, Carlos has been doing a great job of evangelizing this. So
Yeah.
you definitely link to his stuff. Yeah, as far as how folks can get involved, we've got a CNOE interest channel on the CNCF Slack. That's generally
Okay.
where we chat. So show up there, say hi, ask questions. If you go to our site, I think it's CNOE.io, CNOE.io. Should have documentation. So there you can like find a link to our tool and use it, as well as like more descriptions about what the reference platform is itself. Beyond that, it's an open source project. So folks, feel free to like contribute code, PRs, issues, etc., all that fun stuff.
Have you started submitting talks for SLC KubeCon for this, or has anyone submitted anything yet?
No, I probably should. I'm still
coming
kind of
up.
like recovering from KubeCon EU. But
Oh yeah. Well, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for your time, Greg. I'll post a lot of the information and stuff about what you're talking about in the description, and people can check it out there and get started contributing. But thank you so much. Do you have any parting words?
No, it was great chatting. And I don't know, we've seen one of my favorite things about this tool is that it came out of a real use case internally. It wasn't like, oh, we're trying to solve some abstract thing. We just saw an internal problem, we solved it, and we heard lots of great feedback from other people who were saying they have the same issue, like, oh, I want to CI my infrastructure that I'm building on top of Kubernetes, and this thing helps me a lot. So yeah, hopefully it's useful.
It's probably helpful too because it's maybe an opinionated option that's outside of one of the other vendors that you might be like it's not just like Red Hat's opinionated OpenShift stuff. Like this is talking about like a completely different setup. So super interesting to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're trying very hard to be vendor neutral in this solution, in this space. So
that's awesome. Well, thank you so much.